What if the Bible isn't what you think it is? What if the texts that are held sacred are filled with secrets, echoes of an older, forgotten religious power struggle? We're not talking about theological arguments here. We're talking about divine conquest and the deliberate manipulation of history on an institutional scale. We're peeling back the layers to reveal the storm gods and sea gods that the biblical narrative was quite literally built on. Dr. Kipp has written something remarkable in his new book, God's Propaganda. It's bold, unflinching, and deeply thought-provoking. In this video, I'll walk through some of the key themes in the book and offer my own reflections on how the biblical authors drew from the mythic traditions around them. Now, to be clear, any critiques I might have are not meant to turn you away from it. Dr. Kipp's book is essential reading, one of those rare works that manages to unsettle and illuminate at the same time. Today, we're diving deep into ancient texts to see how biblical authors systematically subverted and erased their divine competition, not with fire and brimstone, but with the subtle, surgical strike of a pen. To understand the core conflict, we have to travel to the ancient city of Ugarit and take a look at the Baal cycle. This isn't just mythology, it's propaganda disguised as epic poetry. The ancient storm god Baal wanted to build his palace on his mountain, Mount Zaphon. This was a clear strategic power play, intended to shift the entire divine economy away from the older patriot god El and his mountain, Mount Lalu. This was a changing of the guard, an ancient coup d'etat, a story of a dynamic ascending deity seizing power from an established and perhaps weary older patriarch. Now fast forward to the Bible, and you see the exact same power move being executed with chilling precision. Psalm 48 performs a remarkable act of textual takeover. It doesn't just mention Mount Zaphon, it claims it. It shifts the divine power base completely, tearing the authority away from Baal's mountain and grafting it onto Mount Zion, the heart of Jerusalem and the designated home of Yahweh. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a strategy, a blueprint for divine conquest, used again and again, designed to strip all rival deities of their geographical, economic, and political assets, funneling them all directly into the Jerusalem temple complex. To pull off this millennia-long propaganda war, a process that involved multiple generations of scribes editing and re-editing text, the biblical authors developed a systematic playbook, 4 strategies of divine conquest, techniques the author used to bury the evidence of rival gods and consolidate power under Yahweh. The first technique is conflation, the merging of 2 gods into one, achieved either by treating their names as synonymous or by transferring one deity's actions and attributes to the other. Elimination occurs when an author removes a god from the divine realm, by killing them off, portraying them as immortal, or denying their existence altogether. Substitution is when an author removes the name of a god from the narrative and replaces it with the name of another god or title. Rivalry is when a text depicts 2 gods in conflict to show which one holds greater power or authority. Elijah's showdown with the prophets of Baal is one example, as is Baal's defeat of the sea god Yam to prove his supremacy over El. The texts that used these techniques were not always written from scratch. Sometimes authors would use an earlier text to build their narrative upon. Even later authors would build upon those texts so that they became like Matryoshka dolls, narratives nested within narratives, each one a layer of fresh propaganda built upon the subverted corpse of an older text. Understanding this allows us to see the theological and political fractures in the Bible that modern readers are often shielded from. I believe this to be the case with Psalm 48. Inside this psalm are 3 layers of text. The first layer has to do with a legendary fortress named Zion. If you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, Zion would have been thought of as something similar to Helm's Deep. The next layer has to do with Baal and his Mount Zaphon. And finally, the last layer has to do with Yahweh. Let's take a look at the text to see how one builds upon the other. The first layer has to do with Zion. Before Zion was synonymous with Jerusalem, it was a legendary fortress in an unknown location. The Zion layer contains a short section about Zion. In it, it talks about how a group of kings approached Mount Zion, saw it, and ran away in fear. The next layer was written by a pro-Baal author. This is the only layer that mentions Elohim as a proper noun used as a singular subject. As I've showed in a previous video, when an author added a layer to a text, he would remove the name of the God that was in the text and replace it with the generic word for God, which is Elohim. In this case, the Yahwist in the third layer changed the name of Baal to Elohim. The Baal author uses the conflation technique, not to combine two gods, but two mountains. And this is where we get our first oddity. In this layer, it says, beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion in Zaphon. That in Zaphon part is awkward, and I think a sign of redaction because it's essentially saying that a mountain is in a mountain. It's the pro-Baal author trying to conflate Mount Zion with Mount Zaphon. This is one reason why I think the god that was replaced with the word Elohim is Baal, since he was associated with Mount Zaphon. Another reason is that there is a sudden shift at the end of the Zion layer. Whereas the Zion layer talks about kings and Mount Zion, the Baal layer shifts gears to talk about merchants in the sea. Also, I believe this reflects the tension between some religious institutions during that time. Each religious institution wanted more worshippers for their god so that they could receive the sacrifices, tithes, and resources that those worshippers brought. And although they weren't monotheistic, they did sometimes see other religious institutions and their deities as competition. In ancient coastal cities such as Ugarit, there would have been considerable tension between two types of deities, storm gods and sea gods. Storm gods would have been popular in the agrarian communities surrounding the coastal cities, and sea gods would have been popular among the merchants that sailed the seas and docked at the ports of those same coastal cities. Stories such as Baal's defeat of Yam may reflect this tension in the institution of Baal's effort to promote their storm god over any sea god. I think we have this same type of effort here where it says, with the east wind you smashed the ships of Tarshish. Wind is one of the hallmark features of Baal's identity, and this line pushes the idea that Baal had power over the sea. The Baal author also shifts the strength of Zion as a fortress over to Baal by stating that he has proved that he is a stronghold, and Baal makes Zion stand firm forever. Finally, we have the Yahwist layer, adding in the name of Yahweh and conflating Mount Zion with Jerusalem. This conflation is seen throughout the Hebrew Bible using techniques such as parallelisms to equate Jerusalem with Mount Zion. The Yahwist emphasizes that Mount Zion is near the original reader and not in some far-off mythical place by encouraging the original reader to walk around Mount Zion. But what happens to Mount Zion after the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem? That brings us to another psalm, Psalm 74. The first layer is the El layer. Once again, the name El has been replaced by the word Elohim during the Yahwist layer. It's in the El layer that the author asserts his god over the sea by having him battle the sea monsters and Leviathan. Dr. Kipp says that there remains an echo of the conflict between the great monsters of the sea and Yahweh in Psalm 74. But it's not an echo between the sea monsters and Yahweh, at least not originally. In the earliest layers, it was about a conflict between the sea monsters and El. How do we know? Because when the Yahwist editor came through, he diligently executed the substitution technique, replacing the name El with the generic Elohim almost everywhere. Almost. In verse 8, it reads, "They burned every meeting place of El in the land." Why, after careful editing, did the author leave El's name exposed here? Because if he had replaced it with Elohim, the original reader would have assumed it referred to Yahweh, and that would imply multiple shrines to Yahweh existed across the land, a fact which directly contradicts the official Jerusalem-centric doctrine that the temple was Yahweh's sole home. This would have caused an immediate political and theological crisis for the centralized Yahwistic establishment. The redactor was thus forced to leave the original name in place to avoid a bigger theological disaster. It's a massive, unredacted piece of evidence left behind in the dirt, proving that the cult of El preceded and was systematically wiped out by the rising power of the Yahwist cult. This brings us to the Yahwist layer, who's concerned about that very issue, prompts him to insert lines about Yahweh's holy temple, recounting how it was destroyed. Another insertion by the Yahwist brings us back to the location of Mount Zion. Now that Jerusalem had been destroyed and many had been exiled, the Yahwist shifts the location of Mount Zion away from a physical location, and instead refers to the tribe of Israel as Mount Zion. Let's take a look at another text that has a possible conflict with the sea. Exodus 15, known as the Song of the Sea. Dr. Kipp points out the connection with the sea conflict in his book as well. He says, the song conflates Yahweh's triumph over Pharaoh and his army with his victory over the watery forces of chaos and creation. There is definitely conflation, but is it conflation of two victories of Yahweh? Or is it conflation of a Yahweh triumph with a triumph of another God? Let's take a look at the text. Most of the text is clearly Yahwist, but the section in question is verses 7 through 8, where it talks about conflict with the sea. There is no mention of another God in this section, not even the generic Elohim. However, there may be a few clues that this section is pulling from another text, or oral tradition about another God. The first clue is that Yahweh is mentioned a couple of times just previous to the section. This is typical of the Yahwist when trying to integrate an earlier text. The second clue is that El is mentioned in the Yahwist layer, and the Yahwist is trying to conflate the name of Yahweh with the name of El, when it says, Yah is my strength and my song, he is my savior. This is my El, and I will praise him, my father's Elohim, and I will honor him. This sets the anchor point that Yahweh and El are the same before the reader gets to the part that was originally about a separate God named El. There is also an odd detail here, one easy to miss if you're not looking for it, the image of breathing fire. In the Exodus story, there's no fire-breathing Yahweh splitting the sea. The text doesn't give us that. But tucked into this song, the Yahweh seems to want us to take it as a metaphor, a bit of poetic flourish. Still, it feels like something older is breaking through, an echo of a different story, one that came before. And it's not the only time this happens. The same kind of strangeness surfaces again in another so-called ancient song, the Song of Deborah. This song is a victory hymn celebrating the defeat of the Canaanite commander Sisera by the Israelites, led by the prophetess Deborah and the warrior Barak. The climax centers on Jael, who kills Sisera by driving a tent peg through his head. Only 10 tribes are mentioned in this account, not 12. And that absence, it matters. Dr. Kipp suggests this points to something earlier, something before the unified picture we're used to. A tribal confederacy maybe, loose, fragile, but bound together by necessity. I think this text may not be as early as many think. At least, most of it isn't. But there may be a layer that's even more ancient than we think. Once again, most of this song is Yahwist. There isn't a name of God in this song that is replaced by the word Elohim. But there may be 2 deities hidden in plain view. In an earlier layer, here in verses 20 and 21, it says, the stars fought from heaven. They fought against Sisera from their heavenly paths. The Kishon River swept them away, that old river, the Kishon. If this reflects an earlier tradition of the story, then it was the stars that were swept away by the Kishon, and not Sisera and his troops. So just like the biblical narrative doesn't mention fire breathing in the Song of Moses, so also the biblical narrative doesn't mention anything about the Kishon River being a factor in the battle. And notice what it says about the Kishon River. The Kishon River swept them away, that old river, the Kishon. And notice the emphasis here, that it was a river, as if some people didn't think it was a river. It's also very similar to what it says in Revelation about the serpent. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent. It would seem that type of phrasing was meant to indicate that it's pulling from an earlier narrative. A narrative where Kishon and Sisera were deities that fought with deities from heaven. The deities of Kishon and Sisera were removed from the narrative using the elimination technique, but not by killing them off in a cosmic battle with another deity, but rather by demythologization, the reinterpretation of mythological or divine elements in a text as natural phenomena. But now let's take a look at Jael. In my earlier podcast or blog post, I explained how the biblical author covered up the sexual euphemisms that were originally part of the narrative. Words like tent and tent peg were originally sexual euphemisms, but the biblical author changes the narrative to be about a literal tent and literal tent peg instead. And in the Song of Deborah, we find the same usage of tent and tent peg as in the biblical narrative. In other words, they both contain the same propaganda. Dr. Kipp points out that the song uses older words, but given that the propaganda is so similar in both the narrative and the song, it seems to me that it's more likely that the author used older words in the song on purpose to try to trick the original reader and us into believing that the song is older than it actually is. It may be that in the original narrative, Jael had sex with a divine being named Sisera, which ultimately led to his demise. But the Yahwist layer changes the story in both the narrative and the song. Also, part of the list of tribes may also be propaganda. As I point out in previous videos, the number of tribes of Israel grew through time. If tribes were added to Israel after the Yahweh song was written, then the ancient reader might have thought, hey, wait, where are the rest of the tribes? Why weren't they part of the battle? This later redaction not only adds tribes, but also explains why they weren't in the battle. Ultimately, it still shorts some tribes, but by the time the later tribes were added, the existing tribes in the song may have been too ingrained. So far, we've only looked at texts that have one god trying to replace another. But sometimes there are multiple gods that have been replaced in a text, each layer having to deal with the god named in the previous layer. A good example of this is in Exodus 3. It is perhaps the most significant linguistic sleight of hand in the entire Exodus story. When Moses asks for God's name, he gets the famous answer, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, commonly translated as I am who I am, and is often understood to reflect the essence of what the name of Yahweh means. Alternatively, Dr. Kipp translates it as I am being who I will be. He reads it not as a window into the origin of the name of Yahweh, but as a statement of what the early Israelites most wanted to emphasize about God. And yet, I think both of these readings miss something. So let's look closely at the text itself. Based on what we've seen elsewhere, I believe the Yahwist is replacing the name of El with Elohim. But here we have something interesting in that it appears that the Elohist had been trying to conflate the name of another god with the name El. That god's name was Ehyeh. Before Yahweh and before El, there was a god named Ehyeh at the core of the Exodus story. But the Elohist takes the name of Ehyeh and expands it into the phrase that we are familiar with, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. But instead of translating as I am who I am, or even I am being whom I will be, if we take Ehyeh as a name instead of a word, we might translate it as Ehyeh, that is the one called Ehyeh, or Ehyeh, that's what they call me, or Ehyeh, yes, that Ehyeh. But instead of a philosophical or ontological statement, it is simply a linguistic emphasis. And that emphasis was to conflate the god of Ehyeh with the god of El, who was later conflated with the god of Yahweh. And we can see in this same section that the Yahwist uses the technique of substitution by replacing the name of El with Elohim, and then immediately inserts the name of Yahweh by stating, "This is what you must say to the people of Israel. Yahweh, God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you," thereby conflating the name of Yahweh with Ehyeh as well. We might speculate that Ehyeh was a sun god, given the burning bush part of the story, but any details about this god have been lost to the sands of time. In my next video, I'll be taking a look at the Divine Council. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.